I do want to talk about, because I think you're going to be very good at contextualizing this, but potential news coming from the Counter-Strike scene, which is Rogue is now rumored that they might be purchased by Falcons. And for those of you guys who don't know,
Makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Falcons is the Saudi team with, I put this in quotes, mysterious ownership, right? Like, they won't say that it's the Saudi government, but they also won't say it's not the Saudi government.
Much like Chris Greeley, they won't just make the obvious explicit denial, which would make the case closed. So it's inferred that there's a reason why they won't do that. Yes, of course.
But and this is problematic, obviously, because there's a massive conflict of interest when there's a tournament in Saudi Arabia hosted by the Saudi Arabian government, produced by a company owned by the Saudi Arabian government, with a team playing in it that's owned potentially by the Saudi Arabian government. What does that mean, right? And because Falcons has so much money out of nowhere.
By the way, I can already tell you, when they did the first Gamers 8 last year, before it was called Esports World Cup, Team Falcons, before they had a good lineup, Monty, when they had a lineup with like French players and people that weren't famous, they got invited to that tournament. So what you're alluding to, like, there's a world where surely they just get crowbarred in EWC every year if they get bought by Rogue, right? If they buy Rogue, rather.
Yeah.
Seems logical.
Probably, right? That's what you would
assume. It's your
team.
Why wouldn't you?
Yep.
Yeah, why wouldn't you?
And also, for the purposes of the Saudi World Cup, like, they have signed something like 20 different divisions across all these different esports. Some of which, they've already won. And I think that what they won called Warzone, I think, already.
I know they have a daughter team that's very good.
Yeah, so they've got a bunch of actually extremely competitive teams across a variety of games on the world stage. And so, when you look at this, you're like, okay, well, we know now, and if you guys don't know, they tried to buy Astralis' spots last year, which is the spot. Didn't that spot become Carmine Corp? I think it did. Yeah, that spot became Carmine Corp. They tried to buy it last year, and Riot actually turned them down, because I'm sure they offered more money than Carmine Corp did. And the question is, why does Riot turn this money down? Well, one of the things that Riot does is that they mandate that ownership must be disclosed of their teams, which Falcons may have just straight up refused to do, right? And also, if Riot is thinking, hey, we're going to keep, if we're going to sign off on this Esports World Cup, by the way, guys, the news came out that the Olympics Committee magically selected Saudi Arabia to hold the International Olympic Committee has said, Saudi Arabia, you're going to get a bunch of esports events. And they're allegedly, according to the reporting that's been done, talking to Riot about letting League of Legends there and stuff like that. Well, what happens in these situations where you have the Saudi government involved, and that would be nations based, so I think it's less of a concern in League of Legends. But what happens if you're doing Esports World Cup? What happens if there are Riot events? What happens if at some point down the line MSI does end up in Riyadh? Well, and then Falcons is invited, right? Or Falcons qualifies to that tournament. How can you make sure this is unbiased? Because even though Riot has, I would say they say that you can't have ownership in multiple teams. The reality of that is we know that, the rules were bypassed, especially in
Golden State Warriors shit. Famously in the LCS, there was like multiple investors in the same orgs, and they were allowed 2 years to divest or whatever. So they've always played fast and loose. It's obviously just based on if they like
whether
you or
they
if they
like
don't
you.
want to.
Yeah, whether they like you or not, because like Fnatic was also demonstrated to have owners that were part of ownership groups of different teams, and they did nothing. They said, you have 2 years to unwind this investment, which is I wish I had gotten 2 years to unwind my investment, guys. I didn't get that, obviously. But when you look at Falcons, they are very opaque in terms of their ownership structure, and it wouldn't surprise me. You'd be like, well, why are they opaque to Riot? Well, they don't give a shit about Riot at the end of the day. The Saudi government is much bigger than Riot, so I don't think they care, especially when they can participate in all these other esports. But what is your take on Falcons and why Riot wouldn't necessarily want them to be part of the LEC, considering they would probably spend a lot of money on the team and on the players?
I mean, my take is this, Monty. I don't think they were saying to them, we don't want you and we don't want you in LEC. I think what they were saying was, we'll give you a slot next year or we'll get you a... Because to me, the reason you let Karmine Corp is just that fan hype. It's like they were the one for years simmering in the LFL. Everyone knew they had the huge fan base. Everyone knew they had the blue wall and all that jazz. And you knew, by the way, as well, that when they come in, they will invest and they'll do things like get the stadium and do all the things you want teams to do, because what you want to show is this is essentially Karmine Corp in some way is the legacy of what you tried to do with the LEC. You've tried to create a league where these like separate countries could have their own sub-league, and one day it would build up to a point where you'd have authentic like grassroots fan base. You know, in theory, Karmine Corp is everything you always wanted in LEC. So to me, I think they would just want, like, they'd already been rumored they'd buy in past years. I think they were just first in line, as it were, Monty. But I actually think, like, if you're the Saudis, it was almost like, we'll get you on the next one. Because I think that it's logical they buy in. And by the way, here's what's going to blow people's minds. Bearing in mind, I don't control if they buy in. If they do buy in, Monty, I'm actually in favour of it. Because the good news is they haven't done it yet in CS2, but it's constantly rumoured they are going to. The premise in CS, Monty, is they're just going to keep spending money until they have one of the best teams. They're just going to keep doing it. So that's why there was news recently that they've again supposedly gone and tried to get Nico and Monacy out of G2 and CS. If people don't know, Nico's one of the best players ever, and Monacy is the best player right now. So if that's inferred what you're going to do, and if you don't know, in CS, they literally bought the best coach ever, Zonic, who'd won all the majors in CSGO. They bought Magisk, who was one of like the role players who won loads of majors, was even a major MVP. And then they bought the core events, who was like at the time like a top 5 team. So there's the reason why this is good news. Because think about what we just talked about with Rogue, Monty. Essentially, Rogue did all of their success through scouting. Remember, they had those players on their academy / their ERL team in the Ultra League. Then they used people who were veterans like Odoamne and Vander to guide the young players through. And then eventually, after doing a mixture of like small roster moves and academy promotions, they had a lineup that won the championship and had all those times in the foul. But then the problem they had is that's like being an NBA team that can only do it through drafting, and then you lose the drafted players. Well, now you have to buy the players, and they're not a team that's ever shown Rogue that they have the big box and that they can attract the big talent. Like, think about who the biggest names to ever join Rogue are. Bro, it's nobody. I'm serious. If you think of like people they've signed, not people they brought up from an ERL or their own ERL team, it's nobody. They've never signed big. The joke is like Odoamne is probably the biggest name ever that they've signed in that whole org time period. So you already see like that org was not an org that was willing to put mad money out there. Dude, I think Falcons will mix it up. I think they will come in this league and they will potentially buy these big names and make like a super team. So I'm on that level. Once I get past the business things and what I think of them outside the server, I think it will add to the LEC ecosystem. Like, I'm sort of looking forward to it. I want to see what happens. I want to see if they come in and they do, like, as we're saying, dude, maybe this is the team that comes in and then you go to Fnatic and you go, you know what? I want Razork. Here's 1.5 times what he's worth. Hey, again, like you said earlier, Fnatic isn't some like giant Yankees team. They're a team that if you offer them more than the value of a big contract, they should probably take it. They themselves should re-up with a different player and take that deal, take their own ERL talent or something, right? So I actually think Falcons could be the game changer in LEC. Like, this could really mix up the ecosystem a bit.
I mean, again, it just depends on who they end up actually hiring for it. But it does seem like they're very committed to overtime. I mean, didn't some of the CS players like refuse to play on the team because it was Saudi owned, even though they were offered a lot of money?
Did that. It was just Twists who went to Team Liquid. He turned it down. Now, I will say, he also was in a very privileged position in the sense he not only had Team Liquid, suppose he had an offer from Vitality, who at the time was the #1 team. So he was on FaZe Clan, which was also like a top 3 team. Yeah, so he was in like the best position ever. But he did publicly himself say he didn't want to be involved with that shit, and the inference was because of the Saudi. But that's the only player I'm aware of publicly has ever like implied they won't play there.
Yeah, I mean, also Twist is not only really good, but he also has a massive North American fan base that he brings along with him, right? So his value is pretty crazy, I think.
I also personally predict that that comment will age very poorly, because here's the part he hasn't thought about, Monty. He's acting in his brain like the current setup of one Saudi team is how it will be. I personally predict in about 5 years, he might have to magically join a Saudi team, because what is he going to do if they buy like half the top 10 or something, you know, like, because there's the other thing. In the same way as we're talking about in LEC, I think there's a world where in CS, that's the other move you do. When these teams start to look for investment again, you just come with your million tentacles of abstraction. You have a sponsor for this guy, a partner for this guy, an investor for this guy, sleeping. You do all that, and eventually you just have half the top 10, and then they're all playing in your terms. They're all in the EW. Why wouldn't you? It's the game plan Nickel and I on put out himself all those years ago. The difference is the Saudis can actually execute on it. So I also think that will stage poorly. I think he'll find out one day. And by the way, even if he doesn't join their team, Monty, as Richard's pointed out, it's inferred eventually everyone's going to be there as like a second hub anyway, and you're just going to be boot camping there and going there for tournaments in the off-season. You're going to be doing everything. So we'll see if that one works out. And I don't think in League anyone's going to say anything. Like, I think one thing I actually think a fair play to them, if it's true, I think League players already don't think of themselves as being able to speak out against things like that anyway. So I think League players won't say anything. They'll just join the team, mate.
Yeah.
I will give a fuck.
I also, and to put Rogue into context, guys, so Rogue was actually started by Sterling VC, which was the Wilpon family, and they own the New York Mets, the baseball team in New York. And they were also, I think, funded by Bitcraft, and they were part of some like tangled web of like esports investment and bullshit hype companies for a while. They also owned...
Now you think they were owned by fucking Roger Sterling from Mad Men, who's having too many martinis on an afternoon and passing out, not knowing what he did. It turns out he just transferred onto Amne or something. That's not a bad reference there. If you know the show, Still the Head Fox. Yeah,
so like they like it was Rect Global, which acquired them, which I think was Sterling VC as well.
Even though they did that to me down with the kids, it's even spelled R-E-K-T.
I know,
it's like Rect never sounds good, not least because it sounds like the word rectum. It's like Rect Global. How about?
So yeah, Rect Global.
It's even applying for that. Like, I've got all my paperwork here to apply for Rect Global LLC. Like,
I may be confusing it actually. Hold up.
No, it was Rect. They were the ones that bought it.
Rect Global was. I don't know if they're involved with Sterling or not. So I may be incorrect about that. But like, there was all the problems with Infinite Reality and Rect Global and the payments that when Ibai was like, when they were briefly Mad Lions coy last year, and Ibai was supposedly covering their expenses. So the point is, the bottom though has fallen off out of this organization, and like Rect Global, and they keep changing their names, which is why I'm confused. Like, there's like Infinite Reality was the company that ended up like owning this, but they ended up being so like full of shit as well. So it's just been bounced around like a hot potato. And so this is, it just continues. It continues to be a cloud fiesta.
I'll tell you why, Pete. I'll tell you a very simple thing that people, if they follow football, will know what I'm about to reference, right? Which shows you why Riot want Ibai and Carmine Corp in the LEC, right? Do you know how ridiculous streamer culture has gotten now, Monty? That like Ibai, for example, there's a video where like yesterday or something, he was actually like celebrating with the Spanish national football team that just won that cup and holding up the European Championship Cup. He's just a fucking streamer, dude. But like, just because he is a streamer and he is Spanish, he got to like be at that fucking celebration and be doing all that shit with all those like players that just won essentially like the biggest football tournament in the world right now. Like, that's how ridiculous. That's why, unfortunately, esports will always be somewhat tethered to stupid shit like, and here's Tyler One with his take, because as you see in Valorant it's like Shroud and fucking Taric, in League it's Tyler One. Like, the streamers themselves are bigger than the esport in some ways. That's the problem we have. So we're always just like part of their clown show, unfortunately. Even though, by the way, think how like whack that would be if you actually did take like the biggest real sport in the world and just have like some bozo streamer guy on the broadcast like, what are you doing? That's esports though.
They did put Ninja in a Super Bowl commercial.
That was just a commercial. You could at least turn that off. He did, this equivalent, Monty, would be like if he was just on the halftime show, like, hey, what do you think, Ninja? Who's going to win? I don't know, bro. Whoever gets more touchdowns.
Ninja was on the New Year's Eve countdown in Times Square, which was nationally broadcasted. Like, tens of millions of Americans watched. So it's not that weird, I would say. But yeah, so like, anyway, the point about Rogue is like, they're obviously in dire straits. Their parent company has clearly been having financial issues. So it wouldn't surprise me to sell. And like, I think that it was probably pretty embarrassing for Riot last year to have all that news, and especially potentially have Ibai pull out entirely. Like, it's good for them that he went over to Mad Lions instead, because losing him would mean that the LEC would lose significant amounts of viewership. And this is a guy who just actually, like, last week set a new record on Twitch and had like 3.5 million concurrent viewers on his stream, which is fucking insane. So losing this guy would have been terrible. And I think, you know, the embarrassing part of this for Rogue and for Riot was that, hey man, he's having to cover these losses that Rogue is facing. So they can't be in a good position. And I imagine that if Riot is forced to choose between Falcons, who are very financially solvent, and Rogue, they're just going to pick Falcons. So I think that transition's probably coming up.
See more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, you know, be a pleb and don't.